Hello, everyone. It's such a delight to be here today and talk about, in my opinion, a really fun topic. A little bit about myself. I work at Bentley. I teach in the management department. I'm also the assistant chair of the department. Most of my career is actually comes out of industry. I come from the health and aging services space. I've spent about 15 years at that C-suite level, primarily as a chief operating officer. And the last decade or so, I've really moved more into that consulting space. I'm also a ICF certified and emotional intelligence certified coach, and that's something that I really enjoyed doing, working with executive leaders throughout the country, um, primarily helping them navigate things like change, navigate things like leadership. I have a doctorate in executive leadership with a focus on organizational change. Um, my undergraduate degree was in math. That's a big shift that I made as a career, as you would quite imagine. And then I have a graduate degree in healthcare administration. And with that, I'm going to switch gears and have Jaro introduce herself.
Thank you. And thank you so much, Dr. Barber, for welcoming me into this session in this power hour. I'm also a big change fanatic and love the topic. And thank you, Sarah, for the introductions. So, as mentioned, my name is Dr. Yaro Fong-Olivares. I also work here at Bentley University. I'm the executive director of the Center for Women in Business. And my background actually is a little bit non-conventional. I started my career in nonprofit, never thought I would be doing anything related to business or business school, but always loved learning and education. Then took a pause and pivoted to be a personal trainer, which is where I started to interact with a lot of high power executive women who would come and receive training and started to share with me their organizational challenges. And then that led me to get my master's in change management, similar to Dr. Barber, and then get my doctorate in organizational leadership psychology with a focus on the neuroscience of leadership, which is how I ended up joining this conversation. I love the science behind human behavior, and I'm really excited to get you to be more informed and more in control of your brain and your behavior. Dr. Barber?
So, with that, it's just such a delight for the two of us to be able to have this conversation with you today. And we're going to get started. What I'd love you to do is just take a moment and think about this quote. Experience is not what happens to you, it's what you do with what happens to you. And to me, it's a great reminder of how we transition through life stressors. Whether it be workplace burnout, which we're going to be talking about today, or just even personal life stressors that we deal with. I always think and always say to myself, I am the only person who can determine how I respond to what life throws at me. And that's really what our discussion is all about today, particularly when it comes to life and the things we can't control. Um, particularly on the job, as we know, right? There's a lot of potential for stress and burnout. And yet, if you think about it, these are choices that we make of how we choose to respond to those stressors. And that's really what we're going to spend the next 40 minutes talking about. So let's get started. Here's our agenda. We'll start with what exactly is burnout and kind of what's the difference between stress and burnout. And then we'll move into a brief discussion of really what do we mean when we say this term, the neuroscience of change. And we'll end with some helpful strategies that are really practical and simple and can make a really big difference in how we navigate really those life stressors and how we navigate organizational change. So, with that, I'm going to pass it back to Jaro to talk about stress versus burnout.
Yeah, so I promise I won't take too long doing the science piece of this conversation, but I find it fascinating and I actually find it very motivating knowing the science behind some of the strategies that we're going to talk about. So, first things first is to differentiate between stress and burnout. Everybody has stress. We are never going to get rid of stress, right? Some stress is positive, some could look like excitement or like a new opportunity. And the research shows that about 80% of folks experience work related stress. Now, the key here here is to remember that not all stress is created equal, and that some stress is going to be negative impacts, and it's going to be impacting you differently. So again, looking at the statistics with 3 in 5 reporting negative impacts, that's a lot of us. And we know that the last few years have been particularly stressful with COVID and all the different changes, and most recently with all the additional changes that are happening in our social political context. That being said, there is positive and a silver lining. What we want to think about when we're thinking about stress and burnout is that burnout is the prolonged stress unmanaged. And so while we all have stress every day, day to day, the key here is to really focus on how you manage your stress so that you can prevent getting to burnout. Burnout is the chronic experience of stress. The other piece of burnout that is really critical to remember is that it cannot be isolated to one aspect of your life. So while we are talking about burnout, workplace burnout is also influenced by what's happening in your home, what's happening in society, etc. So again, Center for Women in Business, for us women, it's critical to remember this because of all the different pressures that we may face in the home and different demands on our time. A little bit of science behind this. One interesting piece of the brain is the HPA axis, and the HPA axis stands for the hypothalamus, adrenal, and pituitary gland. And essentially, it really describes the process by which cortisol is developed, and cortisol being the stress hormone. And so essentially, you experience a stressor as a human in the world. Then after that, hormone is released, and that can lead to more of a physiological reaction that then can lead to a variety of challenges with memory, with cognitive functions, executive functions, and decision making, and all of the necessary parts of our daily life and our work life. Then the flip side of that is understanding the brain structures that impact our self-regulation, right? And so again, thinking about how we are reframing the experience of stress to prevent it from becoming burnout, one key way is to think about your practice of self-regulation around your day-to-day activities. And the structures of the brain, so the parts of the brain that are related to that are the prefrontal cortex, your amygdala, and your hippocampus. I like this image that I learned in graduate school, the hippo and the campus. So bear with me and my dad jokes. But it's a good way to remember the area of the brain that we are thinking about when we're thinking about stress and burnout. And the key things you want to remember here is that, sorry, thank you, is that with the self-regulation structures, this is a process of, again, managing an adaptation, right? So you want to create different practices, and that's what Dr. Barber is going to talk about in a little bit as we get there. One thing that also you want to think about is what's called the amygdala hijack. And a lot of us have heard this. It became very popular terminology in the internet, but I like it because it really kind of concretizes what the behavior and the experience that each of us has when it comes to this impact within the brain structure, right? So thinking about the amygdala, it's an emotional center of the brain. And thinking about the amygdala, we have very specific behaviors and experiences that come when we have this experience of the hijack of the amygdala related to the flee or fight response that we get when we experience a threat or experience perception of threat in the workplace or in the world. And I'm not going to go through all of these, but we certainly know that we will experience an increase in our heart rate, some skin and temperature increases, or sometimes decreases, but definitely a change. We may experience some goosebumps, which I think is really interesting, sweating, etc., increased blood sugar. And the thing I want you to remember about this particular piece is that the brain is wired to help us survive. So these are all evolutionarily wired reactions to the experience that we're having. And so that's a good thing. We want to be able to survive in the world. The disconnect happens when we associate regular day activity, let's say a stressful work meeting, with this experience of survival, right? And so your brain is going to react as if you're in the wild and as if you need to flee or fight, when in reality, you may need to, again, go back to the practice of how you are showing up to stressful situations with mindfulness and other types of activities. And I want to leave you with this idea of the SCARF motto. And I think what I like about this is very simple. And it allows me and others to really focus on how to manage and self-regulate. And the SCARF motto is a way to think about the managing of responses to the reward or threat that we might experience in our day to day. Again, we're focusing on the workplace, so we'll consider the workplace. But it's this idea of what really is it that folks really need to be able to have an experience of safety and what might cause threat. So, for example, the S stands for status. For a lot of us, status, like our role and our ranking in an organization, is really important. And so that may be something to pay attention, especially as leaders or even as colleagues, when someone cares a lot about their status. Certainty. So again, being able to predict what's going to happen. We've all heard this before too. If you had a little bit of exposure to brain science, you know that we all want to save energy and that the brain wants to make sure that it's able to predict behavior and is able to predict what's coming next. This is very critical as we're thinking about the subject of today, change management and transitions and the neuroscience of change. In that, again, it's normal for us to really avoid change, and still we must go through it, right? Autonomy. So again, really thinking about agency and how we are using our organizational culture and norms to ensure that folks have the feeling of agency. The opposite of that, and autonomy, is really when there's a lack of control. Again, to state the obvious, a lot is going on in our world and in our workplaces, right? So being able to really balance that scenario with the feeling of autonomy and agency. Relatedness, this is where the belonging piece of our work really comes in. It's really just the interaction that we need with other human beings. And so, again, with the context of hybrid work, work from home, and thinking about how we are navigating the changing workplace, how are we ensuring that we are continuing to connect with one another in order to, again, create a safe foundation to be able to have a safe brain experience, so to speak. And then last piece, my personal driver, fairness, right? So I like to talk about this piece because for some of us, being in a leadership role might be related to the status. For me, it's really about wanting to advocate for fairness. And that's something that's really important to, again, notice and know as you're learning about yourself and other leaders as well. So I'll pause there, and I know Dr. Barber is going to talk about burnout and the strategies. So I'll pass it over to you, Dr. Barber.
Great. Thank you. Just a little bit more about burnout, thinking about burnout specifically. These are some percentage, some data shared by Gallup. Gallup, as an organization, is constantly monitoring things like engagement scores and burnout scores. And in a recent poll, what they found is that when asked, the one of those recent studies, they found that people felt burnt out. 28% of the survey respondents actually felt that they were burnt out very often or always. I mean, that's significant. Always, that word. And about half of the respondents felt burnt out at least sometimes. So different from stress because this is that prolonged experience that people are having. That we have almost half the workforce potentially that is feeling this on a regular basis. And then we know, just the physical and physiological impacts, right? So we know that people get sick more often. It lends themselves to get going to the emergency rooms more often. So you see some of those statistics. And this isn't just a US dynamic. This is happening around the world. In fact, in 2019, the World Health Organization actually deemed burnout as a worldwide response. And the definition they use, what you just heard, is really a syndrome resulting from the chronic, unmanageable workplace stress. This definition and these three dimensions that they identify actually come from the work done by Christina Maslach, who actually is a social psychologist at UC Berkeley and has been studying this dynamic for 30 plus years. And one of the things that she says is, organizations typically think of burnout as like an individual problem. And what they really need to understand is individuals work in organizations, they work with teams. And if we don't really recognize that combined conversation we need to have, that it is a team and organizational dynamic, is equally as it is an individual dynamic. And as we look for solutions and look to support our individuals, we have to first start in understanding what's going on within the organization, within those teams. Some of the causes for burnout, I'm not going to go through them, but you could see really quickly, it's probably pretty intuitive, right? I actually, in my graduate class last evening, it's a leading change course. And even college students, right? They came up with all these same reasons of the things that are stressing them out on a daily basis. Too much work, insufficient support, really not having that healthy balance between life and work, not having control over their choices, their job, their decisions, and unfortunately, sometimes that toxic work culture or just an unsupportive work culture really impacts them. And so I want to ask the question to you. I'd love to you to drop into the Q&A on a scale of 1 to 10. When you think about on an average basis, on a day-to-day kind of average basis, just think in terms of your level of stress. A 10 would represent, I'm so completely overwhelmed, I'm truly burnt out. A 1 would be, yeah, I really don't experience any stress on average. What's your number? Go ahead and add that to the Q&A if you wouldn't mind. Just give us your number. I see some numbers coming in. I thank you. Go ahead if others can share. That would be fabulous. Few numbers. And if you wouldn't mind, those of you who have are comfortable sharing your number, go ahead and add to the Q&A, if I can get the screen to click. What are the reasons for stress for you? What are some common reasons that come up? And just try to come up with like one or two reasons. Thank you for that. I see uncertainty, workload. A lot of those reasons are very similar for most people that really fall from that slide that I just shared with you. And we're going to move on unless anyone else wants to add. Too much work, lack of control, feel that my work might be eliminated. I mean, that's really frightening, isn't it? Lack of recognition, right? Too many projects. So thank you, all of you, for sharing. These are the things that everybody's dealing with on a day-to-day basis for the most part. And when we think about stress, and Jardo actually already talked about it, a little bit of stress is a good thing. When you look at the typical stress curve, you see over here there's this thing called optimum stress, right? A little bit of stress is good. It motivates us. It gets us to be, a little bit faster, a little bit better performers. It sometimes is exciting to us in some ways, right? It's a new challenge. So that's a great place for us to sit. It's when we move into this prolonged amount of stress in which we're starting to feel exhausted. And then, bottom line, we're breaking down physically, physiologically. It's having real impacts on us as individuals and then ultimately on us as an organization. And I want you to think about this. So, we already know that's happening. And now we're adding organizational change. It's a recipe, honestly, for disaster. And that's what we're up against organizationally. The reality is, organizations are continuing to change. The pace has increased. We're adding more transformational projects. And as a result, some of these terms have become very popular over the last several years. Terms like change fatigue or transformation deficit. And essentially, what these terms represent is that employees are exhausted. They don't have the energy, they're not putting forth the effort. And when you think of the transformation deficit definition, it's really this gap between individuals' willingness to do the work of bringing about the change relative to the amount of change and effort that's needed. So, this is a real problem for us organizationally. And a relatively recent study, this came out from Gartner in 2022. And what they showed was that when they surveyed, and I think it was something like 900 organizations' top leaders, and when they asked them the question, kind of the pace of change, what's going on, what those organizations on average said that they had in the prior 3 years brought about at least five pretty significant business transformations. And in the upcoming 3 years, that's kind of 22 to 25, they anticipated to undertake even more big organizational changes. And yet, look at the next quote. In 2016, the level of willingness to support change from an employee standpoint was at 74%. This is just 6 years later. It had gone down to 38%. This is part of that kind of change fatigue that's happening. Now, I imagine, and I'm waiting for Gartner to come out with another study that shows us like 2025 data. I would suspect that we're down to probably in the 20% range of the level of willingness. Every time I talk to organizations and talk about where they're at, people are exhausted and they don't have the energy and they don't feel that they can, really put any more effort towards another change. And I love the smile that's popping up. So whoever did that automated emoji, I love that. So we're going to move into our interactive moment for us. And the question that we're going to start with for Jaro is, from your perspective, knowing what you know about burnout, what do you think is the most important message for leaders to hear when it comes to workplace burnout? What would you say?
I love this question, and it's two pronged. I'd say number one, as I shared earlier, the idea of burnout, that burnout is preventable. It doesn't mean that you don't work hard and that you don't have stress, but you have to pay attention to the level of stress and the cadence of stress for your organization. You have the opportunity to interrupt those cycles by creating more organizational policies and activities that help employees and colleagues really get back to a homeostasis or a baseline of well-being. And so I think that's number one. It does require some vigilance in terms of making sure that we're not staying behind because, as Dr. Barber shared, organizations have to go through transformations. I mean, we're constantly changing, technology is constantly changing. If I hear the AI transformation one more time, but it's very real. And in order to be up to date, we have to be able to engage our folks and our people in that transformation. So really pay attention to the cadence of change and the cadence of stress. And then number two is that we do our best work when we are in a well-being state, right? When we're in burnout, we have diminished cognitive resources, so we're just not as smart as we could be. We have less tolerance, we have less adaptability, less creativity. So you're not actually getting the best outcome as a leader in an organization if your staff is overly taxed or in a burnout state, right? So both things are critical for you to think about is you're not getting the best product and you're also able to prevent burnout.
I love that. Thank you. And I'm going to actually build on that and take a slightly different twist. And I highly recommend all of you watch this TED Talk from Kelly McGonigal, who is a health psychologist. And she shares a variety of studies that really changed her philosophy about how you think about things like stress and burnout. And in one study, she talks about it, there were over 30,000 adults in the US monitored over this 8-year period of time. And the differentiating factor that they studied was if people believed that stress was harmful to them. Those individuals that believe that stress kind of kills, they actually had a 43% increased risk of dying. Those individuals who didn't believe that stress was harmful, they thought stress was actually a good thing and it helped them, they actually had the lowest levels of risk in terms of that potential for dying because of stress. And the new science of stress is really beginning to suggest that when we change our thoughts about how we view stress, it will have an impact on how our body reacts to stress. And here's another study that just showed what happens is when we kind of view stress as a good thing that kind of gets us going and ready and we're able to handle it. What often happens is that stress response tends to mimic kind of joy and courage. And what's really happening is that neurohormone oxytocin is being released, and the more it's released, it's actually sort of nudging us and encouraging us to want to connect with other people, to seek support. And it's that community, it's that connection that's actually helping us navigate those stressful situations. It also increases our empathy. And while we're under stress and we're reaching out to others, naturally, what tends to happen is we also start to care for others. The more we care for others, the more we release more oxytocin, which tends to create greater stress resilience. And what's happening, because oxytocin actually has some natural benefits, it's an anti inflammatory, it actually can strengthen the heart's response. And in one study, what they found is that those individuals, they looked at two groups of people all dealing with stressful events in their life. One group was very much in a caring, focused mode of caring for others. The other group wasn't in that mode at all. The group that, even though they were dealing with stress, because they were caring for someone or other individuals, they actually had no physical negative benefit, not benefits, negative outcomes from stress. They had zero. So, what it starts to tell us is that our mind is a really powerful thing. And based on how we view stress, it can have an impact of which hormones are released in our bodies. And it ultimately affects how we physically and physiologically are navigating stress. My second kind of recommendation that I would want to share with leaders is this. And this comes out of the Gallup organization, a lot of their research over the years. And, they say one of the easiest things you can do as a leader is connect with your people at least on a weekly basis. If you can do it daily, that's even better. But on a weekly basis, just have a conversation with them, check in, see how they're doing. But they also call out these three things to do. Focus me, right? When we have so many things going on organizationally and we don't know what the expectations are or what I should prioritize, when as a leader, you can say to your people, this is where I want you to focus. Put your energy here. It's okay to let go some of those other things. We can extend those timelines. Free me. That's the second thing, right? Remove those obstacles for me. Make my job easier, right? Do everything you can to help me accomplish what I need to accomplish. And I've always said for years, what I say to leaders all the time, the main job you have is to support your people and remove obstacles so they can get their work done. And that's what they're getting at from Gallup in this message. And the last thing is we got to know our people as leaders. We have to know their strengths. We have to know the things that they struggle with. We have to share that with them. Sometimes we have blind spots. We don't always know these things about ourselves. And it's okay as a leader to guide that person to say, these are your strengths. Let's leverage those. This is where you're going to need some partnership and support from others. So, really simple approach on a weekly basis. Connect, focus on these things, and that helps to kind of alleviate some of that stress for people. We're going to move into a little bit about the neuroscience of change. And before we start, I'm just hoping you'll join me in a Q&A moment again. I'd love to hear from your perspective. What are some of the strategies that you have found over the years that really help you navigate stress, burnout, organizational change? What have you found works for you? Go ahead and share with us at least one strategy that you have found for yourself. I'll give you a moment to type and think. As we're waiting, I love the person who wrote the comment about just the need to upskill, reskill, and as a manager, how this impacts people, right? It's really stressful because, and we're going to talk about this in a moment, so I'm going to hold off. But at the heart of it is fear, and so bear with me because I'm gonna answer that question. And if I don't adequately, let's come back to it for sure. And Jaro, same thing to jump in. So, talk to colleagues, right? That's a great, when we have community, when we have connection and we're just releasing it, there's real power to when we call it out, it actually starts to shrink it for us when we start to talk about it, venting, right? That verbal release. I love that you said that. Being unplugged on the weekend, like I have been working on that my whole life. I love the fact that you're able to do that. Maybe by the time I'm 90, I will learn how to do that. Just daily self-care practice. I so appreciate these. And let's see, I'm missing Patrick. What was yours? Yeah, no meeting blocks of time. That's really powerful because it gives you a sense of control, right? I can block out these 2 hours and I can just do what I need to do. All these things are so helpful. So thank you, everyone, for sharing. And we're going to move into that neuroscience of change conversation. And because I am a fan of the possibilities of AI, I love that I just lately go to ChatGPT, all the other ones out there, and I love to see what definitions they give me. And I particularly love this definition. It's spot on when we think about the neuroscience of change. And what we're really speaking to is that we have all these underlying processes that enable us to learn, to adapt, to change our behavior, to shift the patterns of thinking that we have, and ultimately shift our physical state, which is just so cool. And so we already talked about the fact that, if we shift our thoughts, it can influence our body's reaction to stress. We also know, and we're not talking about it in this webinar today, but we also know there's a lot of other research out there that says even if we shift the way we hold our bodies, right? You've probably heard of Ann Cuddy's research on power poses, right? It increases the right hormones, it decreases the stress hormones, and it once again changes the way our bodies react to stress. But you know what's behind a lot of stress? A lot of it comes from just bottom line fear. That's almost our natural effect that the natural reason we feel stressed. The fear of the unknown when we're facing a lot of uncertainty, if we're feeling a loss of control or a loss of autonomy. Fear is really at the heart of all of it. And it's a natural reaction to organizational change. If I have to upskill and reskill and learn a new skill, and I don't know if I'm capable, I don't know if I'm intelligent enough, I don't know if I can learn it quickly enough, it's coming from the core foundational element of fear. Fear is a natural protective aspect of our human brain. When Jaro talked about the amygdala hijack, right? It's all about fear. It's just a part of our physiological makeup. Our brains like certainty. Our brains work really hard to create patterns and automated processes. And so anything that threatens that, which change threatens that, um, it's essentially viewed as a threat to our brain. And so we're trying to kind of resist it. And so a key element of really kind of navigating this sort of wiring that we naturally have is to really raise and focus on self awareness. The more that we understand why and how we react to situations, what's driving them, what's behind, those ways that we think and we respond and how we're feeling. The more we pay attention to that, the more we have the ability to do something with that. And one of the most, natural, easiest strategies that we can deploy is what we call reframing. And I know you've all heard of this, right? It's a really popular thought. And it's crazy. It's easy and it's simple. And, when we notice that we're starting to go down, I always say the dark path with those negative thoughts, if I'm thinking I can't do this, it's too hard, it's too unmanageable, when I can catch myself and notice that and intentionally, right, shift my thoughts, it will then shift how I'm feeling. It will then shift how I'm responding. I can change it to anything I want. And in this case, I give you the example, okay, it's a challenge that I'm going to get through and it'll help me grow and develop, right? So let's hear a little bit more about the science behind cognitive reframing.
One of my favorite things to talk about. Actually connects to what we said earlier about what leaders should remember. One of the catchphrases of neuroscience and pop culture is neurons that fire together, wire together, right? So neurons is how our brains associates different data points that it accepts. And so what we're talking about when we're talking about cognitive reframing is essentially you managing your thoughts in order to control the rest of your behavior and reaction to that thought, right? So, what emotions come with it, what behaviors you're going to take as a result of that thinking or thought, right? And so, being able to remember that, as Dr. Barber said, if you associate fun or something positive with some stress, then your neurons are going to wire to associate stress to something fun, right? So again, very simple concept, but very hard to practice. So that's the background in terms of cognitive reframing. Once you start reframing, then your brain starts associating more positive thoughts or more positive perceptions to the different reframes. The great thing about reframing, it gets easier and easier as you do it. So it might be contrived at first when you try this, and you may feel like, oh my God, I have to really try to push myself to reframe. The more you get into that, again, given the brain's desire to recognize patterns and make things simpler for us, the easier that it will be for you to do that. Related to that, making sure that reframing, remember that helps you control the amygdala and your emotions that come with it. And last but not least, thinking about neuroplasticity and neurogenesis. So this is about the creation of new pathways within your brain. So again, just because in the past you maybe had an association to stress that was negative, the more that you practice the positive association, the more that will be the automatic reaction that your brain takes. To me, that's like a superpower. I don't know about you, but when I learned that, I realized, wow, I have, again, a lot more control over my reactions than I really thought I did. And having practiced this and other practices like mindfulness, I can honestly tell you that this stuff really works, and highly recommend science-backed, and especially for those of us who are in a very rapidly changing environment, which is most of us.
Thank you. We have on this next slide, which we're not going to go through, but some examples of reframing strategies that you'll be able to have the slide and think about them. I want to share with you, and I don't know, it doesn't look like we're going to get this video to play. And for some reason, we're not. But here is the link. This is one of my favorite neuropsychologists, Rick Hansen. He's written a number of books that are, I think, so incredibly helpful. Books on resiliency and happiness. I think now he's moved into like the Buddha's brain and some just really helpful books. And what he talks about is that negativity bias that, and Jaro was talking a little bit about it. We are just prehistorically wired. We have this primordial part of our brain that still exists, and it is wired to be hypersensitive to negativity. And we refer to that as the negativity bias. And we go there fast, and it's hard to get out of that place. And as you were just hearing, we have to retrain our brains to go to the positive emotions. And so this is a really, I think, really great video. It's only 3 minutes long. You'll have that link, and you'll be able to watch it. One of the things that he recommends is that in order to kind of get the positive emotions to really stick in our brain, the negative stuff sticks with us very easily. In order to get the positive stuff, we actually have to hold on to it for at least 10 seconds. And I want you to hopefully throughout the day today, if you think of some type of positive emotion, maybe you have a moment of joy or gratitude, I want you to try to catch yourself how long you hold on to that emotion. When I first learned this, I realized that like most people, we typically hold on to a positive thought for about 3 seconds. We don't stay with it very long. The negative thoughts we stay with for 3 hours, right? But the positive, I will go out, walk the dog a couple times a day, and I will just feel the sun, feel the breeze, hear the birds, and I allow myself to stay there for 10 seconds. I look into my dog's eyes and I share my joy and gratitude for the joy that she gives me every day of my life. But I've learned to hold that feeling, that positive, and what we're really talking about is facilitative emotions. Let them stick by holding on to them as long as you can. And when we're feeling those facilitative emotions like joy, happiness, gratitude, optimism, it just yields all those great results that we want, right? We're more motivated to achieve our goals. We are better problem solvers because our brain, the logical part of our higher level cortex is all working fully at optimal levels. Those debilitative emotions are the things that just shut us down, right? And make it really, really difficult for us to engage with others, to make decisions, to reach the level of performance that we need. And a really easy strategy is as you're starting to observe yourself, to pay attention to your emotions, is to note the activating event. What was the trigger that made you go to that dark place? And then pay attention, observe that negative talk that's going through in your mind. And then here's the key, start to dispute it, start to challenge yourself, right? Because we've got two different versions in our head. We've got the one version that takes us to the bad place, and we have another version that lifts us up. Challenge those negative thoughts and then start to shift your self-talk. We want to move into a little bit about how do we leverage our brains doing the things that our brains like to better support our teams during change. And we're going to see if we can play this video. And I'm not sure what's going on with the videos. It was working before. I'm so sorry. But this is another really great video, just 3 minutes. You'll have the link. You can watch it. And what Hillary Scott, who is a well-known author and change expert, what she talks about is just some really great simple strategies that you have on this slide. And there's some really great conversation about some of these things that we think about, but then it's a little bit of a twist. And so, some little strategies that you can do as a leader to really help people kind of get through the day, navigate change. We know these simple things, right? Break goals into small, actionable steps. She talks about, and I'll go to the last one when we allow people to release their feelings, have an ongoing open conversation about how are you feeling, right? It's time to bring emotions into work. The more we talk about it, the more we release it, the better we come together and support one another. That's what's going to get us through. So she's got, and within 3 minutes, some really helpful tips. And I hope you have a chance to watch that video. I want to talk about one other concept, and that's called emotional contagion. Probably many of you have heard about this, but this really incredible process that happens unconsciously, where we tend to mirror and mimic the emotions of the people around us. And there was a study done many years ago in which they had 10 babies in a room. One baby started crying, and within a matter of minutes, all babies were crying. And what actually was happening is this impact that emotions have on us on a non conscious level. Emotions are chemicals. They're flowing through our bodies, flowing through our cells, but they also emit electrical charges, either positive or negative electrical charges. And so you can think of ourselves as these sort of fine-tuning forks where we are constantly broadcasting these electrical charges, either positive or negative. And what we know about leaders who have high emotional intelligence, leaders who actually spend the time to build those emotional intelligence competencies, they tend to be emitting more positive electrical charges because they're more optimistic. They're able to handle uncertainty and change more easily. They convey to their people a greater sense of calm and ease and confidence. They're more patient. They're better listeners, and they're more empathetic. So, as we develop those EQ competencies, those are kind of all the great, rich byproducts of what happens. And in one study, what they looked at was when you have a high EQ leader, almost 100% of employees say they'll be more productive. And in that same study, about half of those individuals said that they would increase their productivity by at least 50% or more. These are like really incredible numbers. And it's all because they're working with and were influenced by a high emotionally intelligent leader who brought about positive organizational climate. So we're going to end with just a quick conversation. Jaro and I are going to share a couple other things that we feel are really helpful strategies when it comes to workplace burnout.
So I'll share a few first. I love what you were just sharing, Dr. Barbara, because the the neuroscience term of mirror neurons have gotten a lot of attention over the last decade or so. Again, that's the emotional contagion. It can work for good or bad, which is, again, use the power for good. That's why we have to manage ourselves as leaders and as colleagues as well. The main strategy I want to impart with you is to pay attention to what's called the healthy mind platter. So a lot of us know the nutrition plate is very similar. This is a take on that, and it was created to really support our balance and work-life integration on a daily basis. Of course, as I shared earlier, I think in the chat as well, sleep is critical. It's how we consolidate memories. It's how we support our immune system recovery and a lot of other vital functions. So really, I always say if you have to choose between going to the gym, which is the second piece of the mind platter, to engage in physical activity, to always choose sleep, right? And so I know as stress increases and certainly as burnout takes hold, one of the things that happens is insomnia, right? And so there you are now again in a cycle of depletion. The second part of the mind platter is engaging in physical activity. And again, this is a physical activity that works for you. If what you like to do is walking your dog, as has been mentioned, that's a great physical activity that combines a lot of different benefits. You also want to have your brain spend some time focusing on one activity, right? And this can look like reading a book or reading an article, but really, I don't want to get into a these disputes or argument about multitasking, which we have all learned to do, is okay, but you do have to make sure that your brain knows how to still focus on one thing, because again, as was mentioned earlier by Dr. Barber, the brain likes to do what it likes to do, and we want to work with that, not against that. The time for connection, of course, to be related, as we shared earlier. Time for play. I always talk about play because it is critical, and it does not mean playing with your children because that's still work. It means really playing for yourself, wandering, letting yourself be a kid again, and that really goes to maintaining your sense of creativity, and then the last two pieces are making sure that you have downtime and that you have time reflecting. And downtime and reflection time are different, because reflection time, there's still a goal and purpose. There's still the goal is to reflect, but downtime, it's really just unstructured time, right? So for me, I think actually Dr. Barber talked about this, looking at her dog and taking in that positive emotion. For me, I actually don't have a dog, but I go to the dog park and I just sit in my car and I watch other people's dogs. And again, it's not intended to do anything. And that could be 10 minutes of my day before I come into the office. And that really makes a difference in terms of my affect. The piece about downtime that you want to remember is that downtime really allows you to maintain a baseline of your brain balance and calmness, so that you can go back to that in moments of stress, right? So if you never dedicate time to that downtime, whatever that base is for you, then it's going to be much harder to get back to that in moments of stress, which we know are inevitable. So those are the things that I'd say would be good for us to think about. We have some visuals within the CWB that we can offer to folks on the follow-up email and in the deck. But certainly, I think just being able to look at your day through that lens, rather than trying to, as some of us do, manage time, but really manage our energy instead, and manage the mind platter instead.
I love that. I'm going to take 1 second. I know Sarah is saying we have to end the program.
Oh,
I'm going to
don't
take just a,
know.
a minute or two to share a couple strategies that I think can be very helpful. And picking up on that reflection aspect, we have to get really specific when we're reflecting. What is it that we're losing, for instance, or what is it that we're resisting? Is it a person? Is it a thing? To ask yourself a number of questions to try to specify what exactly is going on for you. And at the end of the day, there are so many different reflective strategies. The key is to eventually get to the point where you're noticing what's going on in real time. But before we ever get there, we usually need to kind of do the after the moment reflection. And whether that's journaling at the end of the day or just taking that time after that event occurs to really ask yourself those questions, right? Otherwise, we're in autopilot and we're just reacting. We want to get to the point where we intentionally respond because we're aware of what we're thinking and feeling and how we're engaging. And so, this is, I think, one of my favorite activities to talk about. Just really getting in the habit of constantly checking yourself. What am I thinking? What am I feeling? How am I engaging? How am I acting? And really understanding what's behind all of that. And there's power. This goes back to the neuroscience of change, because if we just change one element of those three, if I change my thought from being frustrated to being curious, that curiosity will almost always lend itself to me then that emotion of curiosity, right, will lend itself to me thinking differently and responding differently. And what I think is really cool when we talk about all the neuroscience research that's been happening, I feel like all those spiritualists out there are saying, well, you're finally figuring out what we've been telling you for centuries, and that is if we change our thoughts, it changes our reality. And so, just another quick tip, this is one of my favorites. Think of those negative, dark thoughts as superhighways, right? We go there quickly, we stay there. You want to build an off ramp to more positive thinking, and it takes time, as Jarl said. It takes a lot of time. You're building new neural pathways, And we have to rewire our brains to think and react differently. That's that whole neuroplasticity that's going on. But we can do it. That's the power, right? That's the power of the ability of our brains to create new patterns, new habits, new thought processes. And we're going to end you with just one final comment. I always say it's about empathy, not only towards others, but to yourself, that self compassion. And I'm going to let Jaro end it for us with our last slide.
Yeah, just a plug for practicing both empathy and compassion, including self-compassion, and to be able to understand the difference in that empathy is sharing in the emotion of someone else, including negative emotions. But compassion really is about channeling positivity towards others and towards oneself. And that is really loving kindness is one strategy that we recommend for that. But just really trying to emphasize that the practice piece of compassion, loving kindness, and building positivity can really make a huge difference in your well-being and the neuroscience piece that we're talking about today. So thank you.
Thank you, everyone. I hope you enjoyed our program. And Sarah's going to close us out real quickly.
Thanks. This was great. Thank you, Dr. Barber and Dr. Fong-Olivares. It's great to think of strategies to use our downtime better and balance ourselves, avoid depletion, think about facilitative, debilitative emotions and frustrations and remaining curious.